In the time that I had originally decided to give this talk, and now a lot has happened to me. I don't remember what I was originally planning on talking about. I think I was going to do something like call a volunteer from the audience and have some sort of medieval torture device on stage. And hopefully in an hour we would just sort of hash it out. And by the end we'd have some sort of answer towards what the meaning of suffering is. That was my plan. But I would like to talk a little bit about some of my experiences that have happened in the past few months and sort of table the idea of finding out a meaning of suffering, and I think we'll kind of get to it through this story. What I would like to talk about is a teacher that I got to know, and to give you a little bit of background about the teacher that I knew. I met him about almost 2 years ago in this room. It was at an international Theosophical conference, and his name was John Drace. And he was a very eclectic and interesting person to me. He was the abbot of a Theosophical monastery, which is something I had never heard of. He was a great promoter of energy healing as a spiritual path, and he had been a Theosophist since 1974, and he was also a bishop in a Gnostic church. So all these things really spoke to me very greatly, and I thought, I had heard from some people, like sometimes you meet teachers on Buddhism or meditation, and I've had friends who met these teachers and they told me, wow, I must have known them in a previous lifetime or something like that. I had a real connection with them. And I was with them and I thought that they were good teachers, but I'm just like, okay, interesting. But John and I had a real connection. And I wouldn't say I knew him in a past life, but I would say that, he's one of those people you wish like almost they're a future version of yourself. Like I'd be okay with achieving what he's achieved. So, and he also came here with two of his monks, Sally and Monica, his wife. And the only reason I mention them is because they could very well be watching or watch this at some other point. And so it's good to mention them. Just for points. So, 6 months later, I actually went out to visit the monastery, and at that point in my spiritual path, in my theosophical path, I had been studying for about 2 years, which is a very dangerous time because you begin to think you know something, and at the same time you have all these questions. And Theosophy, as well as all spiritual paths, is, it's very much self-defined, it's very much subjective. And so I had traveled up the mountain where his monastery was in Del Zira, California. I arrived at their house, the monastery, at like 11 p.m., and he and Monica were there to greet me. And my original intention was to just say hello and go to bed, but we ended up talking for hours about Theosophy, and once I got started, I asked question after question after question, and he was very kind to answer every question I had, and he answered it in a way that made me feel as if it made sense. And I don't think anyone in my life has actually, when you ask question after question after question, usually they say, okay, that's enough. But he had a very understanding and patient presence, and he was willing to answer every question I had. And even the next day, we had gone for a walk, and it kept going. And at some point, I said, okay, the deluge has stopped. I've run out of questions. I don't have any more thoughts. And he's like, okay. And we walked along the property in silence, and we looked at different Lakota, like the stone crosses on his property and sacred sweat lodge grounds and stuff like that. So this is all sort of backstory for kind of what I'm going to talk about. And it's worth mentioning as a non sequitur, after that I got to see Crotona for the first time. And that is as magical a place as people say it is. It's very nice to go for walks on the grounds. It's one of those places where you very much enjoy the atmosphere and the energy. And what I didn't know about Crotona when I first came there is that they don't feed you. Not that I expect to be fed everywhere I go, but it's one of those places where you plan trips to grocery stores with other places. So for about a day, I had scheduled a trip to go to a grocery store with some of my friends, and I was waiting, and I found this tangerine tree on the campus. And even though there's so much citrus in California, which is something we're not used to, I mean, over here we would describe snow to them, and they'd say, "What are you talking about?" They have citrus trees everywhere. And I found this tangerine tree, and I picked a lot of the fruit, and I thought, okay, I have tangerines for the next few days. And I filled my pockets up, and I found some shady spot to sit and have one or two, and I ended up eating all of them. For some reason, I had formed like this bond with this tree, like it's like the giving tree from the children's story. And so, fast forward a year later, and I know this talk is about the meaning of suffering, but this isn't a Greek tragedy or anything like that. You wait for the other shoe to drop. But there is a happy ending to all this, so just kind of ride it out with me. So a year later, I found out that John had cancer. And what's even worse is I found out 3 days before I was going to go visit him. And at first I kind of was grappling with the idea that he had cancer. And then a day later, I found out from a friend of mine that he had actually died in the night. And I was still dealing with the idea that he had cancer. So I was going on a trip to the monastery, but the nature of the trip changed drastically. At this point, I was going up to lend support. My wife and I, Amber, were going to lend support and encouragement towards Monica, his wife, and Sally, his longtime brother. And he's one of those guys who had multiple remembrance ceremonies, and I got to meet a lot of the people who knew him, and I got to mourn properly. He was one of those people that even they went to the Kinko's guy to make copies of the program for this remembrance ceremony they were going to have later on. And the Kinko's guy saw his picture, and he's like, "Oh no, like not him." And they didn't know each other that well, but he just kind of had that effect on people. So, and he ended up giving them a discount on the photocopies because of it. So, and this is kind of the point of the story. This is kind of the point of the meaning of suffering. At some point during all this mourning and these remembrance ceremonies, I felt very open to processing not just my emotions, but the experience I was having. Initially, when I found out that he was sick or that he died, it was more of a shock, and you just kind of put it off till later. But in those moments, I really opened myself up to it. And in part, it was due to the space I was in. I was taking a whole week of vacation, and I was in beautiful surroundings, and I had what I felt was a certain epiphany in that direction, which isn't that important what the epiphany was. The point is that I was able to learn a lesson and embrace this personal truth along those lines. And then, after the week was over, Amber and I went to Crotona again, and I said, "Oh, I have to show you this tree. This is my favorite tree," I said, with childlike wonder. And we went to go see the tree, and of course there was a drought in California, so it was just a dried husk. It was completely dead. And not that, obviously to mourn a dead tree, I wasn't really mourning the tree. It was kind of an echo of what was going on. And in the moment, sometimes you can see the cosmic irony in situations, and I got the joke, but I was almost like offended. I'm like, seriously? Like this now? And Whether it was that God was sending me a message or the universe was sending me a message, or that I recognized the fact that I was having an emotional reaction to a tree dying, I did see that there was deeper to go and more lessons to be learned. I was in that state of reflection and in that state of contemplation where I could do that. So this brings us to the point, the meaning of suffering. The reason I felt this story was quite appropriate in that it had to do with death, because there's lots of types of suffering. There's anger, there's envy, there's addiction. These are all different types of suffering. But in a way, all of them lead to death of a sort. Not the death of ourselves, but the death of the ego, piece by piece. And it only happens, I think, when we're open to it. If we fight it, if we go against it, there's not this epiphany. And, these epiphanies happen in small ways, piece by piece. They're like pearls we put on a string when we learn of them. For me, the lesson had to do with having a spiritual teacher, needing permission, looking up to someone. And I had, the nature of the lessons I was learning is that everything I need spiritually is within myself. It's not something I need to go to someone else to, which when usually these teachings, when you say them out loud, they're things we've been told before. They're things we've read before, but it's one thing to know it and to learn it, and it's another thing to internalize it and being able to apply to your life. And these things happen piece by piece. And each time we learn one of these lessons, a piece of our ego, a piece of our view of ourself as an individual being, instead of a part of a collective whole, gets taken away, gets removed from ourselves. I believe I heard it was either in another lecture, the reference to this saying in the Marines, pain is weakness leaving the body. In the spiritual path, it would be more accurate to say that pain and suffering is the sense of I-ness leaving our sense of personal self. We become less and less of an individual and more part of a whole. And it only happens when we're open to it. Krishnamurti, I think, puts it much better than I did. There's a book by Ravi Ravindra called Krishnamurti, Two Birds on One Tree. And if you don't know anything about Krishnamurti, he was a philosopher raised in the Theosophical tradition, and he was very close to his brother Nitya. And Nitya died when he was about 30 years old, thereabout. And this is an excerpt from that book. In November 1925, Nitya was very sick in Ojai, California. It was one of the very few occasions that Krishna would travel without him. He had an unquestioning faith that the masters would prolong Nitya's life, since his brother was so necessary to his life mission. During the sea voyage on his way to India to attend a Theosophical Society Congress, he received news of Nitya's death. According to the person who was sharing the cabin with Krishna on his voyage, the news, in quotes, broke him completely. By the time the voyage ended, Krishnamurti had found a different inner stand. He had been strengthened by the suffering caused by his younger brother's death. And here's the quote he put of Krishnamurti. He says, "An old dream is dead, and a new one is being born, as a flower that pushes through the solid earth. A new vision is coming into being, and a new consciousness is being unfolded. A new thrill and a new throb of life is being felt. A new strength born of suffering is pulsating in the veins, and a new sympathy and understand is being born out of past suffering. a great desire to see others suffer less, and if they must suffer, to see that they bear it nobly and come out of it without too many scars. I have wept, but I do not want others to weep. But if they do, I now know what it means. I have seen my brother. On the physical plane, we could be separated, and now we are inseparable. For my brother and I are one. As Krishnamurti, I now have greater zeal, greater faith, greater sympathy, and greater love. There are many views on the cessation of suffering in traditions like Hinduism. They talk very much on the idea of karma, of embracing one's karma and the law of karma. Annie Besant writes a lot about that, and there are a lot of lectures and books on that, including Annie Besant's A Study in Karma. In Buddhism, they talk about the Four Noble Truths, which is the first lecture that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. And the Four Noble Truths have to do with dukkha, which could be interpreted as suffering. I could talk about that, I could list that, but I think that for the purposes of this lecture, it would be more beneficial, I think, to talk about what it looks like at the end of suffering and sort of that emotional connection instead of giving you facts and figures about the Four Noble Truths and the ideas of karma. To talk about at what point suffering stops. It is much like the state of enlightenment. The light on the path refers to this place as being incapable of tears. That is to say, it is to have faced and conquered the simple human nature, and to have attained an equilibrium which cannot be shaken by personal emotions, as it states in the commentary on this. What Blavatsky says on the Four Noble Truths is that they are the existence of pain, the production of pain, the annihilation of pain, and the way to the annihilation of pain. But what is the source of pain, she says? Existence, according to the Buddhists. Birth, existing, decrepitude, and death ensue. For wherever there is a form, there is a cause for pain and suffering. But spirit alone has no form, and therefore cannot be said to exist. Whenever man reaches that point, when he becomes utterly spiritual, hence formless, he has reached a state of perfect bliss. Man, as an objective being, becomes annihilated, but the spiritual entity with its subjective life will live forever, for spirit is incorruptible and immortal. And that's from Isis Unveiled, chapter 8. The way I would explain it is, instead of talking about enlightened or these very far-off concepts, I would say that it's about honesty. I would describe it as becoming honest with oneself. In my experience, in dealing with my suffering, you could say that I did what she did or partially did it on whatever level is. I was able to observe my suffering because I was on vacation. I was in a very comfortable place. And what do people do on vacation? They observe things. They sit there and observe things. Even though I was mourning, I was in a very good place to observe the suffering and observe where it was coming from and move past it. And what I would say is that if you were to take what she said and what I'm talking about, suffering is an illusion, in the same sense that the personal self is an illusion. Anything that has form suffers, according to what Blavatsky is saying and according to Buddhism. But if we recognize that we are not the form, then there is no suffering. From a Western perspective, that's not easy to digest, the idea of letting go of the self. That's doesn't make a lot of sense to kind of how we see things. I think it's a good idea to sort of reinterpret that. Instead of suffering, what is more productive is observing. The thinking self observes the higher self. And so when the event of suffering happens, when the event of pain happens, I should say, because as Amber pointed out, suffering is pain without acceptance. So when pain happens, if the conscious mind simply observes what the higher self is doing in that moment, suffering isn't necessary. And from the point of view where most of us are, it's almost like we're kind of unlearning how to suffer. So it's not going to be perfect right away, but rather you could say this is a process towards healing as well. If we have certain things where we're chronically angry or chronically guilty or envious, you observe it and you don't try and change it, but you allow the thinking mind to observe it. And the reason this is possible is because we realize that we are not the thinking mind. Our true self is the higher self, or oneness, or that, or whatever you want to call it. And so we're in a state of pure observance and allowing ourselves to be honest with ourselves about what is actually happening. So, as Blavatsky explains it, and I'm going to give another quote from an article she wrote called "Can the Mahatmas Be Selfish?" We are, by our constitution and state of evolution, we are by our constitution constantly in a state of evolution. We have to endeavor to work along with nature and not place ourselves in opposition to its inherent impulse, which must ultimately assert itself. To oppose it must necessitate suffering, since a weaker force in its egotism tries to array itself against the universal law. All that the occultist does is to hasten this process by allowing his will act in unison with the cosmic will. So in terms of explaining what we just said about suffering, you're going with the flow. And you're allowing yourself to be honest into what part you play in the cosmic dance of things. You're going with the process. So, as we observe the idea of suffering and the idea of letting go of the ego from a theosophical perspective, and the idea of recognizing our true self, there is truth and there is value to that. But I think for most of us in our path, would I relate more to what Krishnamurti stated in regards to his idea of compassion. And I'll say it one more time. He said, "There is a great desire to see others suffer less, and if they must suffer, to see that they bear it nobly and come out of it without too many scars." He says, "I have wept, but I do not want others to weep. But if they do, I now know what it means." And this goes back to what the Mahatmas say, that even though karma is the law, compassion is the law of laws. And I think that compassion is the best approach for where we are towards other people, even though eventually the idea is to get to a point of egolessness. And that is the point of suffering. That's the meaning of suffering.
Comment. I don't think it's the mind that observes. I think it's really what you call the higher self. That's the observer. And when the mind observes, it just thinks about things. And what you're talking about is seeing what's going on before you're thinking. Is that true?
Say that last part again.
Seeing what's going on before thinking.
I guess what I would describe it as, for the Western mind, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's true. The higher self is the observer, but at least in the beginning when we're trying to do this, you can't just shut off the observing mind. You can't just say, be still or be calm. So I think that in allowing the lower self to observe the higher self, there's the beginning of a process that takes place, and eventually one does become egoless in the higher self. But I think that initially, just for most Western minds, you can't just go into the higher self and observe.
With respect to observing suffering, what is the interaction between suffering and observation? Can suffering somehow occlude or obstruct observation, even if the suffering gets too intense? Or can you comment on that relationship?
Sure. I think that the initial agreement that sort of has to come to play, the understanding that the mind has to have, is that suffering doesn't exist, because who we are in the form is the only part that's suffering, and that's not the true aspect of ourselves. So after the self recognizes that simple fact, it can go into a state of observation, even at the most terrible types of suffering, even the most extreme anger, even the most excruciating pain. The body will still feel pain because we have nerve endings. We may even have residual kind of physical symptoms of anger, but if we allow ourselves to simply observe it, to observe that emotion or to observe that pain, then it's not real suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, though, that it seems as if you were to hit that extreme kind of suffering, it's almost like it would pull your consciousness into it to where you couldn't step back and observe.
I could
at least for some amount of time.
Well, I think it's a practice. I think that's it's a practice that not only is taking place in this lifetime, but it takes place in multiple lifetimes. And Blavatsky does talk about that in the article Practical Occultism. Why don't I read it for you now, because I think it speaks to this very well. She says, "No one is expected to carry a burden beyond his strength and powers. There are natural-born magicians, mystics and occultists by birth and by right of direct inheritance from a series of incarnations and eons of suffering and failures. These are passion-proof, so to say. No fires of earthly origin can fan into a flame any of their senses or desires. No human voice can find response in their souls except the great cry of humanity. These only may be certain of success." So I think it's fair to say that yes, that would happen to most anyone, but not everyone. And it is something that we acquire more and more of. I think it's a skill, is what I'm saying.
And I think that last passage explains it very well. So.
Thank you, James, for the wonderful talk. Very inspiring. Would you say then that this practice of observation, could you comment on this, could be also applied not only going through the suffering, but also in our daily life? Because it seems like for many of us, when we are in the middle of the suffering, we are not able to connect with that side of us that observes, meaning that it has to become a daily practice to be familiar, to be at one with that side of ourselves that observes, so that when the suffering comes, you are able to connect with that part. Otherwise, there is not awareness of it, you see. So would you see that as a possibility, or do you see it as only when you suffer you observe?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that you could, if you wanted to, phrase it in the way that every moment that we don't realize our true self is a form of suffering. Mm-hmm. It's just a form of suffering we've gotten so used to, we've gotten numb to it. Mm-hmm. So in practicing observation and practicing that sort of mindfulness, because that's what it is, in every moment, we're alleviating it by recognizing our true self. And in moments of extreme suffering, when we're tested, mm-hmm. and of course we seem to be tested more and more the harder we try, mm-hmm. Then it becomes more and more permanent of us being our true self, or our honest self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And just to share with you some thoughts, because while you were going through this moment at Crotona, as you well know, I was going through something similar with my grandmother. And there is this one thought that came to me and really helped me. And it was something that went like this, is that among many ways of losing a person, the death of someone is the kindest one, you know? Because I have lost people in my life in many other ways that not necessarily have been through a death process, and that relationship has been broken forever, and that pain has been sharper and greater, and that suffering has been actually incremented, rather than losing that person, like Krishnamurti is saying, you don't lose it, actually you gain it. Because, you know, when we were going in Crotona, we had that sense of, you know, of oneness that we didn't know what was happening, right? We were sharing the same feeling. And at that moment, my grandmother was passing away, and you were going through that. So see how different is it? And that thought helped me quite a bit. And I said, man, how can you suffer for, you know?
What I find amazing in my life, and I notice it in many people's lives, is that we were talking about coping with suffering, or learning the truth behind suffering as a skill. And there's all sorts of different types and varieties of suffering that life provides us with. While I may be very weak or very poor at dealing with a certain aspect of suffering, usually there's always people in my life who are very good at it. Yeah, I've always had people tell me, don't let other people affect the way you feel. Don't let other people ruin your day. That was one thing a boss of mine and a friend of mine used to tell me. And he was excellent at it. That's something I've always struggled with. But I think they're put in our lives for a reason, so that we can learn from them, and we can cope with all different types of suffering. Because at the end of the day, suffering is basically one type of vice to have. So, yeah.
I feel that to just accept that suffering helps to focus on what is really happening, and it could also shorten. I mean, there's different kinds of suffering, not all may apply, but just accepting this is where it is now, but it doesn't have to be forever in certain cases. It's helpful.
It's like the phrase, this too will pass.
Two questions. One, in your personal experience, what is the relationship between the healer part of you and the suffering?
You mean from the point of view of energy healing and that kind of thing? Mm-hmm. Well, they teach in energy healing, one of the very basic things you learn is that the practitioner is not healing anything. It's all between the person being healed and the energy taking place. So I think it fits in very well. For me, there was a ceremony, there was a remembrance ceremony. So who knows what kind of energies were going around at the time, and I was just allowing myself to be open to it. So from an energy healing perspective, that's how I would look at it. But even energy healing kind of goes against this sort of non-dual thing that I'm talking about, and eventually, on my path, however many lifetimes from now, attaining enlightenment, which I presume is in store for all of us. Even that idea is something to be transcended.
So here's another idea to transcend, and whether this had anything to do with your realization, the idea of impermanence. Did that have any place in your healing process?
Yeah, I mean, the impermanence of form, absolutely. I think, in a way, either everything, from a certain perspective, everything is permanent, or everything in form is impermanent. So yes, definitely that, and that goes very much hand in hand with what Krishnamurti is. He was saying his brother and he are one forever, and what he was coming to realize is that the form dissolves, but he's one with everything, including Nitya. So, yeah, in a way, I don't think I defined that at the time, but I think definitely.
Thinking about that question about impermanence, I'm thinking about our experience, because I was there at Madre Grande with you when we found out that John had passed. And I had expected that it would be full of grief and suffering and just a lot of sadness, and that's not what we experienced when we were there. And it very much felt like a celebration for him, that he achieved this wonderful thing, that he was able to move on and do something great. And so there was the sense of permanence of, he's still here, he's still doing great things, he's just not in that physical body anymore. So it was very, like you're saying, death is the kindness. There was just a sense of celebration and happiness for the things he was going to achieve and had achieved.